All right, so this is lecture number 6, and I'm going to try and catch up with all the topics that we dealt with too quickly in earlier lectures because we wanted to spend so much time talking about obligations. And I don't know whether I'll get through all of these topics today, but I'm going to try and do my best so that we can then return to the originally planned schedule for the second half of the class. And I'll start with a riddle. Some of you will have seen this riddle before. Two humans, a monkey and a robot, are looking at a piece of cheese, and the riddle is, what is common to the representational processes in their visual systems? And those people who know the answer should keep quiet. I want people to guess. It's a very easy question once you know the answer. Yes?
Cheese.
Very good. And that means the real cheese in the world. And most of what we're going to be talking about today will be about how it can be that we can have visual systems which represent the real cheese in such a way that the real cheese is common to the representation of a human being when the human being sees cheese, and of monkeys and robots. Or anyway, and of monkeys, at least. Now, this is a topic which I was working on for many years before I became an ontologist. So the study of this topic, which can be called aboutness or ofness, the ofness of representation, as when we say, I am now having a representation of Neil. This is a topic which was studied most influentially, I would say, by certain Austrian philosophers who were working around the turn of the 19th century and who influenced 20th century philosophy through the work of people like Husserl. And the éminence grise of this school was an Austrian philosopher who was born in Germany, but still we call him an Austrian philosopher for reasons which will become clear, by the name of Franz Brentano. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Brentano school and its treatment of the problem of the directedness of mental experience. How is it that we can have mental experiences which are directed towards things like pieces of cheese? Now, Brentano was a quite radical thinker in many ways, and he was radical also in that he recognized that most of the German language philosophy in the 19th century, most post-Kantian German language philosophy, perhaps also most Kantian philosophy, was misconceived, not to say total nonsense. And he broke with the traditional 19th century German way of doing philosophy by wanting to see philosophy as being part of science. And so the true method of philosophy is none other than that of the natural sciences. And his main work was a philosophical work, but which was about psychology, and it was called Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. And for Brentano, psychology was an important branch of philosophy, but it was a scientific branch of philosophy, and all philosophy, he thought, should be scientific. So you can say that for the Germans, and Hegel would be the prime example of this, there is a kind of iron wall between philosophy and science. Heidegger continued this tradition into the 20th century, where for the Austrian philosophers who were inspired by Brentano, and including various philosophers who became famous as a result of the work of Tarski, who are now influential in Anglo-Saxon philosophy. Philosophy and science are intermerged with each other. Ideally, they would be one thing. And there were various reasons why Austrian philosophers became particularly predominant in the philosophy of science, part of which have to do with Brentano's influence. So many very influential philosophers of science, such as Karl Popper, Rudolf Carnap, Imre Lakatos, and so on and so forth, were Austrians or were heavily influenced by the Austrian school. And there is no comparably influential tradition of German philosophers of science. All right, so Austrian philosophy can be viewed as having split into two schools, both of whom were very heavily scientifically oriented. One of whom was inspired, led, initiated by Ernst Mach, who was not just a philosopher but also a physicist and a psychologist, on the one hand, and then by Brentano on the other hand, and through Brentano to Husserl, and through Husserl to the phenomenological movement. And both Brentano and the Mach-Vienna Circle tradition had a strong influence on contemporary analytic philosophy because of other Austrians who became associated with the Vienna Circle, such as Wittgenstein, who was, in the 20th century at least, very influential in Anglo-Saxophonia. But also Tarski, as I've mentioned, Gödel, who was also an Austrian, who was closely tied to the Vienna Circle, and so on. Now, the Vienna Circle, have you heard of the Vienna Circle from your other philosophical readings? Anyone not? Not.
But I'm not from philosophy. So.
Okay, I'll forgive you. So the Vienna Circle was a very important pre-Second World War organization, club. It was a group of individuals, some of whom were philosophers, some of whom were mathematicians, some of whom were physicists, who met together at regular intervals in order to discuss a new scientific way of doing philosophy, or indeed a new logical way of doing science. And the idea, the most important idea from our point of view, is the idea of the so-called unified science. Now, as we will see in a minute, the big change from the perspective of the Vienna Circle and of Wittgenstein and of Tarski and of Gödel and so forth, the big change in the approach to doing philosophy, which came about towards the end of the 19th century, was the discovery of formal logic. And this was a discovery made by Frege, who was a German philosopher, and more or less simultaneously by Peano in Italy and by Russell and Whitehead in England. And the Frege particularly influenced Russell and Whitehead, but Russell particularly influenced Frege because just as Frege's main work on the foundations of mathematics was going to press, Russell discovered that it was contradictory. And this was an important discovery because for the first time it was possible to actually prove that a collection of what were in the end philosophical theses were contradictory. Until Gottlob Frege formalized logic, you couldn't prove contradictions in the way that you can now because of what Frege and Russell and Whitehead and so forth achieved. So they created a new logic. This logic enabled you to formulate propositions of science in a precise way. And the language of this formalization is called first-order logic. It was a language codified by Frege, but then more permanently by Bertrand Russell and Whitehead in their work Principia Mathematica. And so it's sometimes called the language of Principia Mathematica. The idea of the unified science movement on the part of the Vienna Circle was to translate all of science into the language of Principia Mathematica. And then you could prove theorems about the consistency of these scientific hypotheses from biology, for instance, with those scientific hypotheses from physics or sociology. So this would be a truly unified science. It failed. It has to be said, it failed for a number of reasons. And I think it was then reawakened in the world of ontology in the late 20th century, and it's now very much alive. The very first paper on the gene ontology is, the subtitle is Towards a Unification of Biology. And the word unification is being used in a very similar sense to the sense it's being used by the Vienna Circle. It's just that the unification created by ontology is much weaker than the unification created by the Vienna Circle idea. The Vienna Circle wanted to formalize scientific propositions, sentences, and then use logic to do inference. The gene ontology and all the scientific ontologies which have come in the wake of the gene ontology are much more modest. They just want to formalize nouns. Now, you can't do much inference with nouns. You can do some inference if the nouns are defined. And so there is a limited degree to which you can express inferential reasoning using contemporary ontology. But it's not making the claim which the Vienna Circle made, that in principle all of science, all propositions of all sciences could be translated into the language of Principia Mathematica, and thereby scientific reasoning would be capable of being done as a part of logic. Now, there are obvious issues with regard to this goal. One issue is that science is empirical, and so we have to have a means of having evidence from perception or from experimentation be an input towards this gigantic collection of propositions which is unified science. But still, it was a very important idea, and it's important to see why it failed. But for the moment, it failed. That's the most important thing to realize. All right, now Brentano was coming along on the outside track while the Vienna Circle was forming itself in the early 20th century. Brentano was the professor of philosophy in Vienna for many years. He grew to be a very influential old man with a lot of influential students who also grew to be influential old men, which meant that a lot of the philosophers growing up in Europe during the 20th century, in continental Europe, and of course we're leaving aside France mainly, but even in France his influence was very strong because of Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and existentialism and all of that, which was a child of phenomenology. So Brentano really was a very important influence across 20th century philosophy in many countries, in Austria, in Germany, in what is now called Poland, in what is now called the Ukraine, in what is now called Bosnia-Herzegovina, in what is now called Croatia, and so on, and Italy, which is still called Italy. Anyway, one of his books is called The Four Phases of Philosophy. Now, Brentano was a historian of philosophy, and The Four Phases of Philosophy is about the history of philosophy. But it's a kind of manifesto for how we are to conceive the relation between philosophy and science. And you can understand it as a kind of philosophical Catherine wheel effect. The idea is that philosophy is the mother of sciences, and sciences are born within her womb. And when she spins, then sciences grow. So the first spinning was... actually, this is wrong. I need to... oh no, it's right. The first spinning, which we'll talk about, there were earlier spins, but I didn't include the slides for them. Or maybe they're in the wrong order, we'll see. The first important spinning was physics. Physics in the era, beginning with Galileo, freed itself from the philosophical influences of old-fashioned medieval physics and became an independent discipline. Now this happened, so Descartes, for instance, and Locke, and Leibniz, and Bacon were philosophers. But they started a phase in the history of philosophy during which philosophy was discovering new problems, discovering reality, discovering empirical knowledge. And because of the strengths which it gained during this upward phase, it gave rise to a new discipline called modern physics. And then earlier, it is somewhat out of chronological sync, but this works. So another science which philosophy gave birth to was economics, particularly through the work of Adam Smith and the Scottish school, who were philosophers, but who founded what we now see as the independent discipline of economics. And then Brentano himself, along with some of his students, and along with a German philosopher by the name of Wilhelm Wundt, gave rise to the new empirical science of psychology. So there was no psychology as a science before Brentano and Wundt. Wundt established the world's first experimental psychology laboratory. And I'll say just a little bit about the other parts of this curve. So what happens is that you have a rising phase of philosophy during which people discover the world and empiricism and wonder, and everything is all goodness. But then that people start systematizing, and it's boring, and you're just tidying up the edges, and so people are longing for something which would be new. But because of this is Hegel, I suppose. Or because of, actually no, Hegel is probably done. Because it gets boring, people striving for something new, they start listening to crazy people. And so you get a depth of mysticism and romanticism and irrationalism and generally French kinds of activity. And then the depths that are reached here provoke people to go back to reality, and that leads to a new rising cycle. And Brentano, he documents a series of rising and falling cycles. And the interesting thing is that all of the rising cycles start with the rediscovery of Aristotle, he says. And so Brentano dedicated one of his early books on the theory of the soul in Aristotle to, I've forgotten now the exact wording, but the wording says that I am dedicating this to my father, Aristotle. And he thought of himself as being Aristotle's true son. All right, so then Brentano died. But before he died, Frege wrote the Foundations of Arithmetic, which is the work which Russell showed was contradictory, and Russell and Whitehead created, using Frege's ideas and other ideas and adding a lot of ideas of their own modern logic, and then Gödel, Tarski, and Turing applied modern logic to create, for instance, modern-day computer science. So mathematical logic and computer science are both products of philosophical wonderment. They are products of a rising phase in philosophy, which gives rise to an independent discipline. And now I want to argue that we are today witnessing the birth of a new science called ontology, which is why I keep insisting that I am no longer a philosopher. So I am in one of these yellow phases. Now, just to see how Wundt did it. So Wundt, in 1879, was a professor of philosophy, but he established the world's first laboratory of experimental psychology. He established a journal, which was called Philosophical Studies. But the journal was to publish the results of his laboratory experiments. So he saw those laboratory experiments as being philosophical studies because philosophy had not yet given birth to the independent discipline of psychology. This process was what Wundt initiated. Now, Wundt did this in Germany. Brentano had already published his psychology from an empirical standpoint, and Meinong founded the first laboratory of experimental psychology in Austria already in 1897. And Twardowski, who was another student of Brentano, founded the first experimental psychology laboratory in Poland. Now, Wundt was very influential in the German-speaking world. Brentano was very influential in the worlds of the the lands, the countries of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many of the early experimental psychologists from America or from England studied with Wundt or with one or other of Wundt's students. Some of them studied with Brentano or with one or other of Brentano's students, but Wundt was much more influential in America. And Brentano himself was based in Vienna. Meinong, who founded the first experimental psychology laboratory in Austria, was based in Graz. Ehrenfels, who created the very first paper on what is now called Gestalt psychology, was based in Prague, along with various other Brentanian professors. And Twardowski was based in what in German is called Lemberg, in Ukrainian is called Lviv, and in Polish is called Lwów. It's now in Ukraine. It was when Twardowski was active in Austria-Hungary, but it was in the Polish part of Austria-Hungary. Before that, it was in Poland, when they had a Poland. Now they have a Poland again. And then there are many in Italy, some are down here, and in these countries also there were professors who were Brentano adherents. Now Husserl became a professor in Germany, but he was born in Prosnitz, which is in Bohemia, which is now part of the Czech Republic, but which was then part of Austria-Hungary. All right, so these people revolutionized psychology. Ehrenfels, who was a student of Brentano and of Meinong, founded Gestalt psychology, as I just said. Husserl and Twardowski were revolutioning psychology by trying to understand the problem of aboutness, ofness, the directedness of mental experience, and that's what we're going to be talking about. This is a stamp which came out for the 100th birthday of Baron Christian von Ehrenfels. Now, I could talk for hours about Christian von Ehrenfels. He was an absolutely crazy polymath. And I have many stories. He took music lessons from Bruckner. And he wrote operas, and which were actually performed. One of his students was Kafka. And Ehrenfels is discussed in Kafka's diaries. You can see references to Ehrenfels, who always used to wear a black cape and a black hat, like Brentano. And one of his son, and I was assuming that I could find documentation of this on the web, because I've only heard these stories from attending meetings in castles in Bohemia, and which I could also, they had several castles in the Ehrenfels family, but they lost some of them in poker games. But I know that this story is true because I saw the film. Ehrenfels' son, I can't remember his name now, I think it starts with a D, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't Donald, was the filmmaker. And when we were shown this film, this was at one of the Ehrenfels meetings that we organized, where we were shown this film, we were told something about the life of Ehrenfels' son. He was a Muslim proponent of polygamy, who was also an early pioneer of the Austrian film industry. Now, I just assumed that there would be documentation about early Austrian filmmaking, but there is nothing about him, which is strange. I saw this film, so he must have existed. And the film is about 7 pathways to heaven, or something like that. And the hero of the film, which I think is Donald, or whatever his name was, the hero of the film goes out into the frozen wastes for 30 days and 30 nights to search for illumination, and comes back because he doesn't find it. And then he goes out with the animals and he lives with the pigs or something for 30 days and 30 nights to find illumination, and comes back because he doesn't find it. And then he goes on 4 more of these trips. And then finally, he goes to the top of a mountain. This is how the film ends. And there is a big rock on the top of this mountain. It's blowing and snowing, and the sun figure comes to the mountain, and finally he meets God. And God comes out from behind the big rock wearing a black cape and a black hat. And it's played by Christian von Ehrenfels. That character is God, who looks just like Brentano, incidentally. So I'll tell one story about Bruckner, which is relevant to the discussion of pain later. So Ehrenfels was very rich, and he took Bruckner to the opera, and he was sitting next to Bruckner in the opera, and it was one of these tragic operas, and Bruckner was crying, and this works much better in German. So I'll try and do it in English. It's hard. He was crying, and then suddenly someone stole his wallet. And Bruckner complained. He said, "Oh, I was crying so well, and then someone stole my wallet, so I can't cry anymore." And so Ehrenfels gave him a big wad of money, because he was carrying money around with him, so that he could cry again. Now, so in the Polish branch of Brentanian philosophy was founded in Lemberg, where Lewniewski was one of the leading figures, and Lewniewski created formal ontology, which was based in part on ideas which Lewniewski got from Brentano and from another of Brentano's followers, Anton Marti, but which is very similar also to some of the ideas in Husserl's formalization of Mereology in his logical investigations. And in fact, the first use of the phrase formal ontology was by Husserl in 1905. So all of these figures were trying to solve the following problem. We know that the mind is directed towards things in reality. We can see cheese, and we can decide that we want the cheese, and we can eat the cheese. And our seeing and our wanting the cheese are both cases of mental directedness. The problem is that we can also have mental directedness even when there is no cheese, even when there is no anything. So, for instance, when we're reading works of fiction, the works of fiction are not about anything, but we seem nonetheless to be engaging in very complex cases of mental directedness. All of these philosophers were trying to tackle this problem, to try and understand mental directedness, both as concerns simple perception, where it's clear that there is some object in reality, but also as concerns more complex mental experience, for instance, when you're listening to music, or when you're reading fiction, or when you're suffering hallucinations, and so forth. And the term used by Brentano to capture this mental directedness is intentionality. And the idea is that we have an act on the side of the subject, we have an object in reality, and then we have the content of the act. And the content of the act determines how we are directed towards the object. Some people see the content as being the truly important part of mental experience. Some people see the object as being the truly important part of mental experience. And both of those groups of people get something right. But then they also each get something wrong. So there's no stable combined position, as I shall try and explain. All right. So another feature of all of this is that if we go back to the content here, this content is often expressed by using language. So we say, bring me the steaming cup of coffee over there. And we use language in order to direct the intentionality of the person we're talking to towards a specific cup of coffee. So we have to understand the intentionality of mental experience as being potentially linguistic or linguistically vehiculated. And as a result of that, these thinkers here and other Brentano followers also started to think about the philosophy of language. And one of them, who was a pupil of Lwow-Warsaw, invented modern formal semantics. And there is good evidence that he couldn't have invented modern formal semantics without having formed part of the school which Twardowski founded in Lwow. And now there is a statue, or I guess 4 statues, in the main library of the University of Warsaw, because the mathematical and the logical members of the Lemberg school established themselves in Warsaw and founded the Lwow-Warsaw school. And this is a statue of the 4 leading figures, called the logicians. All right, so we go from intentionality to formal semantics. I will just mention one other character of a somewhat English persuasion in this history. Joseph Woodger translated Tarski into English. Actually, I think he probably just edited. He says, I do not believe that he knew Polish. But in any case, his name is on the flyleaf of the big volume of Tarski's papers. Woodger was a doctor who worked on the foundations of biology. And we'll come back to Woodger in a few minutes, because he was actually a pioneer in the field of biomedical ontology, which we've been talking about in earlier lectures. So the arrow of intentionality can go wrong in various ways. And Husserl had a kind of catalogue of the ways in which it can go wrong, or in the ways in which it can be more complicated or more simple. And we're going to go through each one of these step by step. So these are different kinds of intentionality, if you like. There is relational, there is simple, there is perceptually filled, there is veridical, and there is mediated by language intentionality. But there are also all combinations of intentionality which lack each of those features. So let's start with relational intentionality. And this is the core, the canonical case, the simple case, the case that we all want to be primarily engaging with. And this is just perception. So I see an apple, there is an apple, maybe I think apple, doesn't really matter. Maybe I think food. Maybe I don't think anything, I just see the apple and start eating it. This is relational intentionality. You can't have relational intentionality unless there is a relatum, which is, in the simplest case anyway, something out there in the physical world. Now, let's suppose, as we are doing now, that we are thinking about an apple, but there is no apple. I'm assuming no one in the room has an apple. We are a completely apple-free zone. But we're all thinking about an apple. This would be non-relational intentionality. There is no object. The relatum is missing. It's absent. Now, there is a psychologist called J.J. Gibson who is, I believe, a very important theorist about this relational intentionality, about how not just perception, but very many other kinds of intentionality, including the intentionality involved when we perform complex skills, for instance, flying an aeroplane, or driving a car, or landing a parachute. So I strongly recommend anyone who is interested in this kind of relational intentionality from a theoretical point of view to take a look at J.J. Gibson's ideas. All right, now the next kind of issue we have to deal with is simple versus complex. So simple intentionality corresponds to simple nouns, just apple, or snow, or building. And this, in Brentanian terms, is called a presenting act. But then we can say, the apple over there is right, or the building over there is falling down, or the snow is falling, and then we have a judging act. And the target of a judging act, on some views, is different from the target of a simple presenting act. And then we have higher level complexity, for instance, when we evaluate something or appraise something, or when we have emotions about something. And again, if we want to have a target for this, then some people might say that we have special entities called values. And we can have various combinations of all of these. So, for instance, we can compare two states of affairs. Or we can say that one object is participating in two different states of affairs. Or that one object is more valuable than another object. And in this way we build up more and more complicated relations, or more and more complicated kinds of directedness towards, in the simple case, entities in reality. Now I'll just mention that perception is not just a matter of having a mental process and some content and some target. This mental process is itself complex. So when you perceive an object, then you don't just perceive the object, you also have an experience of the object as being the object that causes your perceiving. So this perception is different from just having sensations. Perception has a cognitive dimension to it already. So you see the object as the cause of your seeing. And you will remember when we were talking about promising earlier, when you make a promise and then you fulfill the promise, then your act of fulfilling the promise is something that you experience as an act of fulfilling the promise. So if I promise to clean all the plastic cups from out of this room tomorrow, and then by accident I sleepwalk during the night and come in here and take away all the cups, then I am not fulfilling my promise, even though I have done the thing which I had promised to do. Because to fulfill a promise, it means to do the thing that you do because you have promised to do it. And all right. Now, the next dimension is the dimension of veridicality. Now, veridicality just means something like true. True of meaning there is some object existing in reality which your act is directed towards. So, if you have a relational act, where there is a relatum, then you have a veridical act, because if you are seeing an object, then there must be an object, and so your act of seeing must be veridical. It must be of something which is really there. But the fact that you're having an act which is directed towards something which is really there does not mean that you're seeing it. So it does not mean that you have an actual relational contact with the object of the sort that you have in the case of perception. So if there is an apple in the next room over here, and if we all think about it, then we have a veridical representation of the apple in the next room. But we don't have relational contact with the apple in the next room. The apple in the next room doesn't cause us to have this veridical thinking about experience. So we have veridicality without relationality when the object is absent, and we have veridicality with relationality when the object is present. And now the next issue is content, and specifically the issue of whether our content matches. Now this is a case of match. The object is present, it exists, and it is an apple, and we think it's an apple. So the content is apple, and it really is an apple. So there is a match between the object and the content. So that's content match. But now we also have content match. But now we have content mismatch. And this is the evolutionarily most basic case, where we have content match, relationality, veridicality, simplicity, and this is what babies can do already, and primates, and maybe even lower animals. And then we can also have a content gap, which can be expressed as a question: is that apple good to eat? So this is neither match nor mismatch. It's something which is a more hesitant intermediary between those two. And now we can have content mismatch if we think something is food, but it is in fact poison. Now, the question is, how do we deal with content? So remember, babies can have veridicality, they can have simplicity, they can have relationality, but can babies have content match? Well, I think they can, because they have the ability to apprehend some things as food, for instance, or as mother. So I think that babies can have content matching, but can babies have content mismatching? And I think they can. If they bite into an apple and it turns out to be a plastic fake apple which tastes horrible, then they will have content mismatch because they thought it was an apple. But there is a school of thought which says that content is always just a matter of language. That if we have mental directedness towards an entity in reality which has content, then that must be because we are linguistic beings. I find this view incoherent, but it was a view which was taken seriously by many philosophers in the 20th century. So, first of all, the cat doesn't have any idea about chess or about royalty, but it can see a chess piece, and it can go chasing after a chess piece. It can put the chess piece in its mouth, in principle. And cats don't have language. So I think that there are linguistically mediated cases of intentional directedness with content match or content mismatch, but I do not believe that all content has to be linguistically mediated. When a cat sees an electrotomography machine, that can be true, even though the cat does not have any idea of what an electrotomography machine is. The cat just sees this machine, not even as a machine, just as a big lumpy object. Perhaps not even as a big lumpy object, but still the cat sees whatever it is that is in the corner of the room, that the cat has to detour around to get to his, I don't know, chess piece. So this is, Sellers is the principal advocate of this view. I find the view incoherent. According to Sellers, the words are what give us a link to objects in reality. And as I say, I find this view incoherent. Now, the alternative view was defended by Brentano and by Husserl, and it was defended in the 20th century by Chisholm, who was a big advocate of Brentano's work, and a big enemy of the primacy of the linguistic, defended by people like Sellers. So he defended the primacy of the intentional. For Chisholm, Husserl, and Brentano, linguistic meanings are secondary to the contents of mental experience, which are not linguistic. So we have mental directedness before we have language, and we can have linguistically mediated directedness only because we already have this more primeval kind of perceptual and emotional directedness. All right, so this little dog wants some food, and this little dog cannot speak language. And this also. So this is the evolutionarily most basic case again. This is the simple perception. And linguistically mediated directedness is not the evolutionarily most basic case. And Wittgenstein, I think, coined a nice phrase to describe what's going on when we're dealing with linguistically mediated directedness. What happens as soon as we get language is that language allows our intentional directedness to go on holiday. So that we can have intentional directedness pointing in all directions, even when there is nothing there. So if we don't have language, our directedness to entities is very much constrained towards entities which are either in reality or very closely connected to what is in reality. Whereas as soon as we have language, we can have directedness up the wazoo. Yes?
So I'm thinking about a case where, evolutionary basic case where there's no language, but where there's still intentionality towards what doesn't exist. So,
for instance?
I have a very young daughter who sometimes she might think there's a snack on the top of the fridge or something, and there is nothing there, right?
Yep.
And she goes, and she doesn't have language yet, but she walks or crawls towards the fridge and tries to get at something that's up there. There's nothing up there. Her behavior is she's thinking about the snack, she's desiring it. There's no language. There's directedness towards what doesn't exist.
I agree with you when you say there is no language. Where I think I would hesitate is whether there is nothing there. So she has experienced, let's suppose she's experienced the fridge as harboring food on top of its shelf before. Then she's got used to the idea that the fridge is a harbor for food. And so she's struggling to get to the fridge and feel around to see what might be there.
Well, let's say there's a box up there, it's empty. There's a box of cookies or something, it's empty. And she thinks there are cookies in there, that's what she wants.
So I think that there are in fact two ways, and I'm going to describe those two ways later on, the two ways in which language can go on holiday. One way is the way which happens when you are engaging in fiction. Now your daughter may be very creative and talented, so that she has fictional worlds of cookies in boxes which she imagines. But I think that's probably not the case. I think more likely it's that we're dealing here with the second way in which language can go on holiday, which applies also to ordinary pre-linguistic intentionality, which is that people make mistakes. So they think there's an apple there, but there isn't an apple there. Just a mistake. It's not mediated by language. It's mediated by whatever the environment has been mediating in earlier experiences, which is why you make the mistake. But you are just making a mistake.
But in that case, I thought you were going to be arguing here this Wittgensteinian idea that language is what allows our intentionality to think about, or to be directed towards what doesn't exist. But it sounds like in some cases it's not language's fault. There are pre-linguistic cases of this. Being mistaken, a dog or a baby.
I certainly wouldn't put it in that way. So I do not believe that language allows our mental directedness towards what does not exist, because I don't believe we have mental directedness towards what does not exist. I think we just think we do. But we'll come back to that later on. Any more questions? All right. So sometimes there is no apple there. That may be because we're making a mistake, or it may be because we are engaging in apple-related fiction. Now, I think it's probably a good idea here to talk about another dimension of intentional directedness, which was dealt with at great length by Husserl in the Logical Investigations, which is fulfilled versus non-fulfilled. And when we have a perceptual experience, we have a sensory content as well as a content of the Apple or electrotomography machine sort. And those experiences which have sensory content, Husserl calls fulfilled. And again, there can be a match between the sensory content of your experience and the perceptible qualities of the object of your experience of the sort which we find in perception. But there can also be sensory mismatch. If you take LSD, for instance, and the apple looks to be like a gigantic multicolored tornado in front of you, that is sensory content mismatch. Now, much of our life, starting with his daughter and going on from there, consists of moving backwards and forwards between lacking sensory content and having sensory content, or lacking sensory content and wanting sensory content, and being frustrated in getting your wanting sensory content to be fulfilled. So when scientists are trying to detect new stars, what they're trying to do is to convert mathematical equations into fulfilled perceptual content, either directly through a telescope that you look at or indirectly through other kinds of observations which you can then use as a basis for inference that that particular star is there where you posited it to be. Now, in the case where there is no object at all, there is no possibility of going from an empty intention to a fulfilled intention. Where there is an object, there is the possibility of going from an empty to a full intention. And in the evolutionarily most basic case, that's what happens. But there is also the possibility of having a fulfilled intention with no object. And that happens when you have something like a hallucination, where you think there is an apple there, but you're just hallucinating an apple. That's different from your daughter. Your daughter is just hoping for an apple, where the hallucinatory case is one where the subject has a sensorily fulfilled experience, like an experience of perception, but there is no object. All right? So, this is what happens when language goes on holiday. You get novels and drama and other such like putatively created worlds which we can explore by reading about them. Now, Meinong was very impressed by the role of such putatively created worlds, not just in our experience of fiction or of other kinds of artworks, but also in our experience of doing science or doing mathematics even. So very often in mathematics, we say things like, let there be a real number greater than 6 with the following properties. And then we are hypothesizing, we're making assumptions. And it may be that we prove that there can be no such number, and then we conclude that as the result of our argument that our original assumption was in fact a contradictory one. And very much of our ordinary conversational life involves speculative discussions of things which never exist or never happen. For instance, meals in certain restaurants at certain times when the restaurant turns out to be closed when you get there. And so Meinong wanted to create a general theory of intentional directedness which was not marked by what he called the prejudice in favor of the actual. Or what we would call a prejudice in favor of veridical intentionality. So he wanted to have the entire jungle of weird cases of non-veridical intentionality have objects precisely fitted to them. And it was a very big jungle, as you can imagine, because not merely is there the elephant in this room, which you're now all thinking about, in a kind of non-veridical, sloppy way. There is also the second elephant in this room, and the third elephant in this room, and the fourth elephant in this room with a black hat, and the fourth elephant in this room without a black hat, and with 27 tails, and so on. And that's only the beginning, that's just the object. So, he wrote a book called Investigations on the Theory of Objects and Psychology, and the idea was that Brentano was going to ground an understanding of the science of psychology in a theory of all the objects that all mental experiences can have, however misdirected those mental experiences would be from the perspective of the evolutionarily most basic case of veridical experience. You can see this is Bertrand Russell's copy here. So Meinong's jungle. Objects which do not exist enjoy equal civil rights with objects which do exist. So this is a small catalogue. So we have real objects, donuts, tables, stars. We have ideal objects. My donut being on the table, that's the state of affairs. He called that an ideal object. And then my donut on the table, but made of chocolate instead of being made of sourdough or whatever donuts are made of. Now this doesn't exist. That's why it's under objects that have being. This is an object which does not have being, but it's a complete object. It has to be made of something. It's made of chocolate. Now, then there are objects which do not exist, which are non-contradictory. And these are either complete objects, like the donut on the table made of chocolate, when the donut on the table is in fact made of sourdough. Or they are incomplete objects, but incomplete objects which we explicitly presuppose do not exist. So a mountain made of donuts, for instance. We all know that there is no mountain made of donuts. It's incomplete because we haven't said what the donuts are made of, because they might be made of chocolate. And then we have contradictory objects which may be complete or incomplete. And an example of a contradictory object would be the round square, or the wood which is not wood, or the elephant in this room which is not in this room, and so on. And then we have incomplete objects not contradictorily determined, for instance, the donut as such. The ideal donut and the... So these are just objects, remember. There are objectives which are the counterparts of sentences. These are just the counterparts of nouns or noun phrases. So we have the donut on the table but made of chocolate is not underneath the round square. Would be an objective in Meinong's ontology, which has the donut on the table but made of chocolate as part, and the round square as another part, and they would be combined by a relation of his behindness, and the whole thing would be posited as existing. It's posited as an existing state of affairs because I believe it. I believe that the donut made of chocolate is behind the round square because I'm a fool. So I'm positing that objective as existing, so it's an existing objective, but in actual fact it doesn't exist. So we have here a case of the non-existing, existing objective that the donut made of chocolate is behind the round square. Now this is not for nothing called Meinong's jungle. And there are some people who like jungle. So there is a big book by an Australian philosopher whose name I've forgotten. I've remembered. His original name was Richard Routley. And he was a greeny kind of person. So he likes jungles. And so he changed his name to Richard Sylvan, where Sylvan is the fairy tale word for wood, I guess. And this big book is called Exploring Meinong's Jungle, and he wrote that book because he really likes jungles, especially jungles as inexhaustibly complicated as this one. This is another book by Meinong. Actually, no, it's the same book. So here is Bertrand Russell on the jungles. It is argued by Meinong that we can speak about the Golden Mountain, the Round Square, and so on. In such theories, it seems to me, there is a failure of that feeling for reality which ought to be preserved even in the most abstract studies. Logic, I should maintain, must no more admit a unicorn than zoology can. Now, I am on Bertrand Russell's side here. I do not want my ontology to be tainted by Meinong. But now I do want my ontology to be able to deal with the mental functioning of human beings. And mental functioning of human beings includes making mistakes, thinking about plans which can never be realized, even thinking about donuts that are not made of chocolate. And so how do I do justice to the possibility of intentional directedness when it's clear that there are some mental experiences which are experienced as being intentionally directed in just the same way that veridical experiences are so experienced, but which have no object? That's the challenge here. Now I'll go back to Wujia. So we mentioned the Vienna Circle and so on. Tarski was a kind of Polish dépendance of the Vienna Circle. And Wujia was a kind of English dépendance, and he tried to realize this goal of unified science for biology by writing a book in 1937 called The Axiomatic Method in Biology. This is a sample page from the book, which will give you some idea of what the language of Principia Mathematica looks like. Now, everything in this book is defined in terms of certain primitives, which is the correct way to do good philosophy, to state all your primitives and then define all the other terms using those primitives. There are certain material primitives, is a cell, is a male gamete, and so on. And then there are certain formal primitives, part of, earlier than, derived by division or fusion from, and environment of. Now, I think this is an amazingly impressive achievement. In 1937, to do what he did was very impressive. Unfortunately, the biology that he was building this edifice on is no longer accepted. So biology has moved very rapidly in recent decades. But still, the fact that he got quite close to what are now accepted as being the primary relations of biomedical ontology, the fact that he had the idea of formalizing biology on the basis of axioms and definitions, I think was very impressive. Now I'm moving from Wujia to talk just a little bit about ontology and the life sciences before I move back to intentionality. So Wujia wrote his book, 1937, War. No one read Wujia's book. After the war, still no one read Wujia's book, probably. Philosophers lost interest in the project of unified science. The project of unified science didn't work in any case. But then in the 1990s, the Human Genome Project was successfully completed, and people had genomes for model organisms on which they could do experiments, and they wanted to combine the results from the model organism experiments with the biologists' understanding of human and animal biology. Now this is the understanding of human and animal biology that humans have, that biologists have and still have. But now they have all this new biology data, and they want to do biology using these kinds of data. They want to do medicine using these kinds of data. They want to understand what's going on here in terms of the data that they are getting here, and how do they do that? So how do you link what you see here, or what you see here, with what you see here? Now the gene ontology solved that problem. the answer is to create an ontology, which is a classification of the types of entities in your domain. In the case of biology, these are entities like cells, organisms, or they are processes like cell division, and so forth. And if you can create a vocabulary for all of those biological processes and all of those biological objects and all of the molecular functions served by molecules, then you can use that vocabulary to tag your gene sequence data, which is just long molecular sequences of letters of the alphabet. And thereby you can give biological significance to these long strings of molecular sequence data in ways which will allow you, for instance, to compare the sequence data that you're getting from fish with tumors in their brains with the sequence data that you're getting from mice with tumors in their brains, to see if there are similarities between the genetic and proteomic and metabolomic and so on basis of tumor formation in fish with the ditto of tumor formation in humans, and draw conclusions then as to whether certain drugs which have been experimented on fish with successfully can be used to experiment on other organisms. So the gene ontology allows you to tag data, genomic data, but now also many other kinds of data, in such a way that the data becomes linked together through the terms which biologists use. And now we go back to mental phenomena. So we want to understand not just the biology of the heart or the lungs or the liver, but also the biology of the mind or the brain. And so we need to extend the ontological method pioneered by the gene ontology, which was almost exclusively relating to bodily biology rather than mental biology. We want to extend it to mental biology. And so we created the mental functioning ontology. And this is just a snapshot of the mental functioning ontology. This is a slightly wider view. So we have mental functioning related anatomical structures, such as the brain. We have cognitive representations. We have behaviors. We have bodily processes. We have mental processes, which we classify as a kind of bodily process. And then we have planning and thinking, which are sub-kinds of mental process. And all of this is based on BFO, which we've been talking about in earlier lectures. So we have in the realm of the mental both dispositions and qualities and processes, as well as independent continuants, which would include things like the brain. And so organism is an independent continuant, the brain is an independent continuant, a behavior-inducing state, such as fear, for instance, is a quality. An affective representation, such as being afraid of something, is a cognitive representation. And the mental process is a bodily process. And we're interested particularly in two kinds of entities here. The mental function, the function of a given brain region, perhaps, and the mental functioning, which is the realization of this mental function. So the idea is that cognitive beings like ourselves have certain anatomically relevant parts in the brain, in the nervous system more generally, which are, the function of which is to enable things like perception, or thinking about, or planning, or imagining, or hating, or fearing, and so on. We're not so much interested in the relevant parts, we're interested in the functions themselves, and we're interested in the realizations of those functions, which are the actual seeing, perceiving, imagining, fearing, and so on, which goes on when we exercise the functions that we have. And then the question is, how do we deal with the phenomenon of aboutness, or ofness, or intentionality? So where does intentionality fit into this vision of a mental functioning ontology. And before I talk about that, I'm going to take the MFO for a trip. So this is not yet official in any sense. This is what I would like to do next. So I want to have a linguistic functioning ontology which extends the mental functioning ontology by taking account of what happens when mental functioning involves language. So as we saw already in an earlier class, I see language very much in terms of linguistic competence. Anyone who knows how to speak a language has a certain complex disposition which is of a kind which they share with all the other speakers of that language, which is called their linguistic competence. And I want to define a language as, or a spoken language anyway, as a speech competence of a population. So the speech competence of a population is a special kind of linguistic competence. It's a distributed linguistic competence which is spread across an entire society. But then this distributed competence is made up of these things, the speech competences of each individual, as its parts. And then we have as a special kind of cognitive representation, a speech-mediated cognitive representation. And that can be in turn of many sorts, depending on whether it's relational or veridical or simple or complex, or whether it's partially perceptual and partially linguistic, or whether it's purely linguistic. For instance, when I say there is a table just like this in the next room, then we are all perceiving this table, but we are having a linguistically mediated presentation of the table which is in the next room. And since I never tell lies, there is a table just like this in the next room. And I checked before. And then we have speech processes, which are a subkind of bodily processes, and hearing processes, which are another subkind of bodily process. And then we do the same thing for reading and writing. And that just repeats what I just said, but we put reading and writing instead of speech. And then there is the combination, which is what happens when we take not just the speech competence and the writing competence, but the two of them together to create a linguistic competence. And then the bodily processes, which realize the disposition which is the linguistic competence of an individual, are processes of writing, speaking, reading, hearing, and so on. And solitary thinking also, to the extent that the solitary thinking is linguistically mediated. All right, so, and there is a small physical part of this. So the brain and the endocrine gland are two of the mental functioning related anatomical structures which are referred to in the mental functioning ontology. But this is not really a neurology ontology. It's not an ontology of the brain, it's an ontology of the mental functions which the brain and the nervous system allow. All right, are there any questions? Yes.
So can you go back to the last slide? So 2 questions. First, what's a behavior-inducing state?
Quality. It says so.
Obviously, but what on earth does that mean?
So, if you get very hungry, you will be induced to behave in a food-searching mode.
Okay, so being in food-searching mode, is that a behavior-inducing state?
Yes. So, yes.
Why isn't that just a behavior? Food-searching.
So the food searching is a behavior. The question is what causes your food searching. Now you have a disposition to go food searching when you reach a certain level of hunger. But then when you reach it, we need a name for that, having reached the level of hunger which induces the behavior of food searching, and that's called a behavior-inducing state.
Huh. So it's like a trigger.
Yep.
Okay. And then, do you have any characterization of what a population is here?
They are not babies are not allowed to be members of the population until they actually learn language. So that all human beings who can speak a certain language. That's all I mean. I don't have. What I agree. This is one of those cases where circularity is decreed to be harmless. You can't get around it. It's the population is the population of speakers of that language.
It seems like we could offer some generalized symptoms of a population, though, that would make it less circular. So, like, you would need a set of common phonemes, which would be used in the utterances characteristic of the population.
If anyone wants to do a better job of the linguistics-related parts of the linguistic functioning ontology, I would be very happy to take all suggestions on board. I think you were next.
So I know the little bit of work I've done in intentionality before, I got hit really hard from a reductionist who tried to claim that there is no intentionality because things like cognitive science don't talk about it and what have you. And this is in line with certain philosophers of mind, like the church ones.
Yeah, I'm coming back to that later on.
Okay.
So
Right.
you should just hit back. That's what I say.
Cool. Sounds good.
Anyone else? All right. So the next thing we did was we took the mental functioning ontology as our basis and we created the emotion ontology. These are some of the subkinds of what we call subjective emotional feelings, which are in turn a subkind of affective representation. And these are the physiological responses to emotions, which we classified, so breathing at a slower rate, muscles becoming tense, and so forth. These are the emotion processes: surprise, disappointment, compassion, embarrassment, shame, anger, anxiety, sadness, guilt, interest, irritation, despair, pleasure, and so on. And we already used it as in an experiment, so we were building this just before a big conference of people interested in ontology with a lot of papers, some of them almost certainly boring. And so we created a small app and gave it to all the conference participants, and we asked them to score each presentation or each sentence, if they wanted to be scoring more frequently, according to which emotion they associate with their feeling when that particular sentence is being uttered or that particular paper is being delivered. And so we created this app called Emonto Tag, and then we tagged. So I feel such and such as a result of this presentation, and then you could put whatever emotion with you. And we sort of badgered them to make sure that they tagged every talk. These were the tag options. I feel surprised, happy, have the pleasure of mastery, passionately loving, and so on. These were the emotions. Then we had subjective feelings: feeling out of control, feeling good, feeling at ease. And then appraisal: I am being treated justly, this is dangerous, this is expected, and so on. And so we got 553 tags, using 67 out of the 89 emotions. And we published a paper about it. And you can find the ontology here. Now we published other papers. So the idea is that we have now lots of experimental results about emotion. And we have chemical results, the chemistry of emotions. Now, Jana Hastings, who has been mentioned at various points along the way, so she was the leader of this effort with Emonto Tag. She is actually a computer scientist, but she would now describe herself, I think, as a computational chemist. And she became interested in emotions I shouldn't put words into her mouth. So there is one very interesting chemical which is connected very intimately with emotions, which is called alcohol. And there is a lot of study about the chemistry of alcohol consumption and the emotions associated therewith, and of course the chemistry of other kinds of mood-changing substances. And so one of the things we wanted to do with the emotional ontology was to use it to tag chemistry data. And this is an example of the sort of tagging that you can do. And but also the plans that we had were to use the ontology also to tag data about how people experience emotions when they're reading fiction, for instance, or going to tragic drama, or watching horror films. There would be a way of using the same controlled vocabulary for tagging data about chemistry, about subjective feelings, and in principle also about different works of art. And even different civilizations might have different repertoires of emotions, which you could then document using something like the emotional ontology. And then we also used it as part of our work on mental disease, because there are disorders, affective disorders, such as schizophrenia. Depression is the most obvious example. Now, that one ontological traffic rule which we have met several times is this: if you want to understand a phenomenon, whether it be the anatomy of the human body or terrorism or disease, then you shouldn't start by looking at all the instances, including the defective or modified instances. You should start by looking at the canonical instances, which from our perspective today means the evolutionarily most basic cases, the cases where everything goes right, the cases which have become fundamental for all the more complex cases which grow and effervesce from these evolutionarily more basic cases. So, let's do pain, which is one of the terms in the emotional ontology. I'm just going to do a little bit of the ontology of pain. So what is the evolutionarily most basic case of pain? It's what we call pain with concordant tissue damage. So you are a baby, you go to the oven and you put your hand on the hot plate and you get pain, and you immediately pull your hand away. And you get pain in order that you immediately pull your hand away. So you get pain which is concordant with the tissue damage. If you only got a mild pain, in that case, that would be not good from the perspective of your survival. If you got a really bad pain from mild tissue damage, that would also be not good from the perspective of your survival. But concordant pain, in this sense, is what makes pain an indispensable part of every normal human being. And then there is discordant pain, where the tissue damage is either much too high for that level of pain or much too low for that level of pain. And then finally there is what is called neuropathic nociception. Nociception means pain experience. Neuropathic nociception means pain experience which is not related to tissue damage at all at the locus where you feel the pain. Rather, it's related to some kind of disturbance in the nervous system between the nociceptive regions of the brain and the extremities where the pain is being felt. So, there are many people who experience neuropathic nociception. They are studied and studied. No one can find out what it is which is causing them to experience pain in their leg, because their leg seems to be perfectly healthy. And the reason why they experience pain in their leg is because the nervous connections between pain region and the leg region are somehow damaged. And that's a picture of the nociceptive system with lots of details. And you can see there's lots of things that can go wrong between the skin, which I guess is here, and the brain, which I guess is here. I'm sure it's here. All right. And then there are the pain ontology will include also pain-related phenomena which are neither discordant, nor concordant, nor nociceptive pain. So there is pain behavior without pain. When people go around complaining of pain and moaning and whining, for instance, when they visit the doctor because they are malingerers. And then there is tissue damage without pain, which is damage of the sort which would normally cause pain, but which for some reason or another in this particular patient does not cause pain. And so this is the entire ontology. So this is concordant, this is discordant, this is neuropathic, this is pain behavior without pain, and this is tissue damage without pain. And then one special subkind of pain behavior without pain is lying about pain. Now, only one of these is this is the core case. Everything else is a variant on this core case. We have all of these other things because we have this core case. This is the reason why we have pain. All right, and so for each kind of emotion, so this applies not just to pain but to the other kinds of emotion, we can find a canonical version of that emotion. So the emotion component of canonical pain is an action tendency to withdraw from the thing which is causing the pain, a subjective emotional feeling which is a negative subjective emotional experience, a behavioral response, for instance, your facial expression goes into a whinging facial expression, and a characteristic appraisal which would be this is dangerous. Now we can do a similar analysis for all other kinds of emotions. For instance, fear. Here the action tendency is either fight or flee. The subjective feeling is again negative. Behavioral response, again a characteristic fearful expression. I can't do fear. And then something real in my environment is dangerous to me. And again, this is the evolutionarily most basic case. So you can experience fear in a horror film, but that wouldn't be this. So you don't have any fight or flight response. And if you do, then you're doing something wrong. And then you can do it for other kinds of emotions. And now, this would be an example of a variant fear. So phobias are a variant of fear. They're not the evolutionarily most basic case. An example would be laridophobia, which I believe is the fear of seagulls. And then another case, non-canonical case of fear would be people taking pleasure in watching horror films. So they are deliberately putting themselves into a situation where their fear sensors are being excited, but not in order to experience the canonical subjective feelings, but in order to have pleasure. All right, now let's go back to Meinong. Meinong's view is that in the cases that we've been discussing of non-veridical intentionality, there is still an object. It's just that the object does not exist. So for Meinong, veridicality extends even into the realm of non-existence because there are non-existent objects. So you could say that Meinong treats non-veridical intentionality as if it were veridical intentionality. You still have a relation to an object even when there is no object, because there is a non-existent object. Yes?
I think it's wrong to characterize Meinong's view as it's a case of veridical intention. Yeah, I guess there's an object, but he's not under any delusion that it exists in any sense. I mean, there's things that subsist, but most things are just, they don't have any existence whatsoever. So it seems a little misleading to present his view that veridicality extends to...
Okay, I agree. That may be unfair to Meinong. Now, my own view is something like this. So, There is only one way in which a family can be happy, but there are indefinitely many ways in which a family can be unhappy. And similarly, there is only one way in which intentionality can be the evolutionarily most basic case, but there are many ways in which things can go wrong. And what we should be looking for is an understanding of how things go wrong when it comes to mental directedness, rather than cataloguing the ways in which things go wrong in terms of things being directed towards special kinds of objects, namely objects which fall short of having existence, which is Meinong's approach. So what I want to do is classify the ways in which mental experience go wrong. And that would be done against the background of a view according to which there is a way in which they go right. And so we try to understand what are the features which, in virtue of which, we get analogues of nociceptive pathology in the case of pain. Now, not all of the cases treated of by Meinong were cases where things were going wrong. So Meinong was interested in assumptions, making assumptions. Let's imagine there's a real number between 3 and 6 which does this and this. Or he was interested in planning. So let's climb the mountain before breakfast so that we can have the rest of the day to read novels. And the idea there is that the climb that you imagine when you are doing planning is a non-existent climb, but you can still do your planning whether it becomes existent tomorrow or not. So the whole point of planning is that you describe events which have not yet taken place and which may never take place in order that you can adjust your schedules in terms of what you want to do. And then, of course, there is the case of fiction, and that we have to work out what it is which is going on when we read fiction or when we go to horror movies. Now, but then finally, there are things which really do go wrong. So there are people, schizophrenics and others, who have delusory mental experiences. And there are ways in which we can be tricked to have delusory mental experiences. There are optical illusions of a whole range of different kinds, which make us believe that we are seeing entities of a certain sort, when in fact there are no entities of that sort to be seen. And it's interesting that many of Meinong's followers in the experimental psychology world were interested in perceptual, optical illusions. And the Italian school of experimental psychology, which was founded by one of Meinong's Italian students, was particularly fertile in the literature which it created on different kinds of optical illusions. All right, so the first idea is that we're dealing with an untidy collection of non-canonical cases. So we shouldn't try and classify all the cases, and we shouldn't assume that there is one approach to classifying all the cases. And this is analogous to what we do when we're doing anatomy. So there is one way of classifying the normal adult human anatomy, and then there are variants of normal human anatomy which arise through different kinds of processes. Amputations are one process, transplants are another process, disease, which is caused by environmental impact, is another kind of process. Genetic anatomical changes are yet another way in which given individuals differ from the canonical human anatomy. And we're going to have a far wider range of cases to deal with here. Yep?
I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing why some of these kinds of intentionality are going to, why they should count as non-canonical, particularly the sorts of things Meinong was interested in, like assumption and planning. I mean, there is no human function if you can't plan for what isn't and may never be. That doesn't seem like so much like a. I'm just having trouble seeing why that counts as a non-canonical case.
So I'm treating the canonical as the evolutionarily most basic case. Now, the evolutionarily most basic case, I think, is pre-culture. So we have humans and other organisms experience pain before they had anything like a culture. Planning is post-culture. You can only have planning if you have culture.
Well,
And in fact,
yeah.
the two presumably arose together with agriculture, because agriculture is the first really clear case of long-term planning of a systematic sort.
Well, then not. I don't mean high-level planning like that. I just mean any sort of. Going out searching for food. It doesn't have to be a human being. Any sort of animal. Going out searching for food doesn't have any particular kind of food in mind. Hungry, goes out looking for the food. There's that. What are they directed at? Right? They're not directed at anything that is anything in particular.
All right, so I guess I can deal with that case, and it's going to be disappointing, but like the way I dealt with your daughter earlier. So, when the hunter-gatherer tribe, or the primate counterpart of the hunter-gatherer, are getting up and going out for the hunt in the morning, what they are doing, I have to formulate this carefully, what they are doing is I think I have to back up. So I have to say more about J.J. Gibson. J.J. Gibson described himself as an ecological psychologist. The foundations of ecological psychology, as the name suggests, lie in the intimate relationship between subjects and their environment. So we never have perceptual experiences just of one single object in an environment-free way. We are always outside the psychology laboratory, which is a special case. We are always experiencing objects in environments of specific sort. And the objects have what Gibson called affordances. They afford eating, or they afford danger, or they afford heat, or shelter. And so when we wake up in the morning, we do not experience an environment in which there is antelope, apple, so that we can point our intentional directedness just towards an object and go and engage with that object by approaching it. Rather, we wake up in an environment, and that environment affords hunting. That's just the way it is. It gives off huntability. It pulls us in. We don't have any choice. We don't plan. We just wake up and we go hunt.
Well, how about I think about a case where there's not planning, there's no explicit planning going on, there's not even any language involved or anything, but I wake up and when I went to bed I was thinking, oh, there's this piece of cake in the fridge and I want to have it first thing in the morning. And I wake up and I head for the cake, right? And it was eaten in the middle of the night and it's gone, right? But when I'm heading for it and I'm thinking about it,
yep.
I wake up and think, oh, okay, I go for it. No high-level planning, no culture, it's a particular object that I'm...
Okay, so I agree with you that whatever I say has to make that case an evolutionarily most basic case. You should agree with me also that the fridge affords waking up in the morning and going to...
Fair enough. But
so we go back to what Husserl had to say about fulfilled and frustrated intentionality. So you are engaging with your environment in a constant seesawing of empty intentions, you feel hungry, fulfilled intentions, you go and get the cake and eat it, and frustrated intentions, you feel hungry, you open the fridge door and the cake isn't there anymore, and then you feel sad. That's frustration. That's all the evolutionarily most basic case. So the evolutionarily most basic case includes frustration of the basic animal desires to eat and so.
And does it also involve an object of my desire that doesn't exist?
So I think I can deal with every such case, insofar as it's a normal, natural, wild type case, by talking about
I don't think the cake is like
the
a
affordance of the
half-walnut
environment, that your fridge normally has cake in it. The fridge affords cakeability. If the fridge is always there, I don't need any non-existent cake inside it.
I mean, it doesn't. The fridge doesn't really matter there, except insofar as that's where I remembered the cake was.
Well,
it's not,
tell
it's not
the
the fridge I want.
Tell the
It's
story
opposite.
without the fridge then, and make it convincing.
It was sitting on the counter.
The counter, that's where you put cake in your household. That's the counter affords being the place where food is available.
I guess I'm just not clear what your answer was. What I'm desiring there, am I desiring? And is the cake the object of my desire, or is it the counter with its affordances?
So it can't be the cake that is the object of your desire, because the cake does not exist. So there's no...
I think it's obvious the cake is the object of my desire.
Yeah, but then we have to tweak out what you really mean by that. So let's come back when you've worked it out. All right, so the idea is that there are many experiences with no target. Some of them are close to the evolutionary most basic case because there is an environment where the target would normally reside. But then we're directed towards the environment in the same way that we are when the environment does indeed host the target. And that's what Gibson deals with. And so let's go through. I just have two cases to deal with. So the first is ontological error. And this is a whole family of cases, but it includes things like hallucination, deception, which is when someone else deceives you into thinking that there is an object in a certain place. And in both cases, the presenting act is dependent on a false underlying belief. So we believe that there is a target, but that is a false belief. There is no target. The belief sententially vehiculates directedness, and we're coming back to this at greater length in a few minutes. But this is the first case. It's ontological error. And the second case is fiction. Here, the presenting act is not dependent on some underlying false belief, because no one believes that Macbeth is the whatever it was, murderer. No one believes that. Everyone knows it's a play. And let's leave aside the fact that there is the actor playing Macbeth. Let's assume that it's just a novel. You're reading about Macbeth. You're thinking about Macbeth. But the thinking about Macbeth is just the kind of emotional, cognitive stream of experiences that you have when you're reading fiction. There is no object, Macbeth, that you are reading about. Rather, you're reading about human emotions, murdering, Scots people, and so forth.